The GTX 780 was one of the fastest cards of 2013, yet times have changed. How does it hold up in 2021? Today, we have a relic of gaming past, the GTX 780. It had a launch price of $649 US, and although I picked up this card for $118 US. This card represented the new high-end using the Kepler architecture. The GTX 780 was a revolution for gamers upon its release in 2013. It had a whopping 2,304 CUDA cores and 3 GB of VRAM, which at the time was a big jump over the previous flagship, the GTX 680 it replaced, which had only a mere 1,536 CUDA cores and 2 GB of VRAM. The reference 780 had a base clock of 800 MHz and a boost clock of 900 MHz. Yet this card we have here today is the MSI Lightning Edition, and it had a factory overclock to 980 MHz boost. To my knowledge, that made it the fastest 780 at the time of its release. So let's jump right into thermals. Compared to modern cards, the thing is an absolute inferno at 86 degrees. It's 16 degrees warmer under synthetic load compared to an RTX 3070, one of the fastest cards on the planet right now. Under a standard gaming load, it's only at 72 degrees, which is only 4 degrees warmer than a 780, and at idle, it's at 35 degrees, which is 5 degrees warmer than a 3070. Moving on to gaming, I targeted medium to high settings at 1080p, yet that wasn't always achievable for the former flagship. The first game up here is CyberPunk 2077, one of the biggest dumpster fires of 2020. And to my surprise, the 780 achieved a wonderful console-level performance with beautiful cinematic frame rates, as you can see. It hit a max of 34 FPS, with 30 FPS average and 20 FPS minimums. If you did drop this down to low or medium settings, you could see closer to 40 to 50 FPS, which is a strong start for one of the more demanding games out right now. Moving on to another demanding AAA title, we have Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which yet again, the 780 surprises, as it comes in with a solid 34 FPS average and lows of 21 FPS. Just like CyberPunk, I really recommend dropping this game down to medium, at least, to get better lows and not be running over the 3 GB VRAM limit, which causes issues and stutters and some of the dips that we see. Next up, we have Metro Exodus, which absolutely murders the 780 with a stuttery 23 FPS average. And with 15 FPS lows, that makes this game close to unplayable at high settings for me personally. Into my favorite game that I've never actually done anything but benchmark, Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This game had massive variations in FPS, going from 80 FPS highs to 26 FPS lows, yet it averaged out at 40 FPS, which is still nice considering the age of this card. Moving on to one of the most popular competitive FPS shooters, we have CSGO, which can really run on an overclocked potato. It has a more than playable 259 FPS average, but drops into the 30 FPS range when walking through smokes or molotovs. Yet, if you were to drop this down, you could more than likely stay over that 100 FPS mark, even walking through smokes or mollies. Moving on to Project Cars 2, this game is much like Counter-Strike in the sense that it can run on almost any form of hardware made after 2011. It had 79 FPS average, which is so far our best result in a game, considering it was on ultra settings. Next up, we have Dirt Rally 2.0, which is another game that I tried on the ultra preset, yet it wasn't the best experience. So here we are at high settings. We have an average of 61 FPS, which is still pretty good for a racing game that doesn't really require high FPS. It's more about the sightseeing than anything else. Next up, we have my personal favorite racing game, Forza Horizon, which is a semi-demanding game. We landed around another very playable FPS number, coming close to 55 FPS on high settings, with acceptable lows of 42 FPS, which shows how well this card is still trying to hang on. Next up, we jump back into AAA title hell and come in with Red Dead Redemption 2. This game is very demanding and almost cripples the aging flagship. We finally are forced to drop down to low settings, as anything else is very close to a slideshow. Yet, at low, it delivers an experience that isn't extremely compromised, as we see another 40 FPS average with modest lows of 34 FPS, which I'd call very playable for someone on a budget, or even just having an older rig and wanting to know if it's still capable. Moving on to our last title, GTA 5, which came out the same year as this GPU launched. Yet, it's still an extremely popular game. As expected, the flagship does quite well in a game from the same era as itself. It comes in with a strong 107 FPS average on high settings and dips into the 50 FPS range, yet this flagship still conquers this game as expected. Conclusion time. Now, it's quite surprising how well this card is held up. If you're someone who doesn't play the most demanding titles and enjoys spending time playing games like CSGO, Valorant, Overwatch, League of Legends, then this card could still be a very worthy choice to pick up on the used market if you're on a very tight budget and you want to complete your first build. It can be had for fairly reasonable prices, so all things considered, it's still a fairly worthy card. The 3 GB of VRAM limit is fairly crippling for today's games, and if you could find a GTX 960 or 970 or a 1060, all of those cards have a little bit more VRAM and they could serve you a little bit better if you want a bit higher gaming experience, but most of those are more expensive. But we'll find out how much better a GTX 970 is in this card next week. Stay tuned for that. I'm BHATech Hunter, and have a good night. Today's video was brought to you by us. BHATechstore.com is now live. Make sure to check it out in the description down below. 15% off site-wide right now. The latest tech reviews and now the latest merch designs. BHATechstore.com.